Hey friends, welcome to our midweek moment. Pastor Nicole here. So glad you joined. Well, this week we started a new sermon series called Behind the Scenes, Popular Scripture Taken Out of Context. And we're looking at those passages of scripture, those verses that are kind of plucked out of the Bible, and we use them for all sorts of things. And we may not be using them correctly because we don't know the context of what is going on. So this week we took a look at Jeremiah 29:11, which says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." And I think this is a popular one because we like the idea of thinking that God has a plan for our lives, that God has purpose for us, and that we're not just living this meaningless existence, but that there's somebody out there who's looking out for us, helping us, has a plan for us. So when we feel like we don't know what's going on, there's somebody who does know what's going on. And I don't think there's anything wrong with any of that. Where I think we can kind of go a little astray, we talked about this in the sermon a little bit, is thinking that God has every step of our life planned out and every single decision, has a perfect plan, and that if we don't go by the perfect plan, that's where we find ourselves in trouble. I think this gets a little tricky because I don't believe that God has everything planned out for us. The little things for sure, like what I'm gonna wear tomorrow, but also sometimes the big things. So I talked in my sermon about a former youth who is having a really hard time deciding what college to go to because she didn't feel like God was telling her the plan of which college she was supposed to go to. Now, I do think that there are certain situations where people are called to a certain college for a certain reason. But I also think that sometimes God says, "Hey, I've given you these gifts and I want you to use them. And I want you to use your free will to use them." And that it's not all planned out how you're supposed to use them or what you're supposed to use them to do, but that God is just calling you to be faithful to serve Him and glorify Him with your gifts. And so sometimes I think like maybe it doesn't matter which college we go to as long as we're faithfully serving God along the way. Sometimes it doesn't matter what job we take as long as we're faithfully serving God along the way. Now, there are some situations where I think God calls us to certain things. So, like for my profession, I felt like God was calling me to be a pastor. I would not have chosen this on my own. I was really against it when I felt God first calling me to it. So I felt like, that was a part of God's plan for my life. But looking back on it, if I had chosen a different college, I think it still would have been a part of God's plan. Like I don't think God had if you don't go to this university, Nicole, you'll never be a pastor. Or Nicole, if you aren't a United Methodist, you're not going to pastor the way that I have planned for you. Yeah, I feel like God has called me to pastor, but I think there's lots of different ways that I can do that, and I think there's lots of different opportunities for me to do that. And I've chosen this one way that fit for my life and seem to make sense. And I think God is blessing kind of what's going on with that. But I don't think like if I decided to change what I was, how I was pastoring, like if I decided to become a hospital chaplain instead of a church pastor, I don't think God's going to be like, whoa, absolutely not a part of the plan. I think God's given me these gifts and I'm using them as best I can. I think that's hard to kind of reconcile sometimes because it's a lot easier for us to just think like God has a plan and I'm following the plan. But what happens when God doesn't tell you what the plan is? What happens when you're not hearing and you just feel like you're kind of out there floating? I think sometimes it's easier to believe that God has a plan and everything is planned out and it takes more faith for us to believe that there are certain things that God has planned out for us, certain things that He's calling us to do, rather than He's ordained every step is planned out, everything is set. It's tricky, but I think when we look at that verse from Jeremiah 29:11, we talked about this in the sermon, it's not really about us personally. It's more about a plan for all of humanity to find salvation through the Messiah. As you kind of continue to read on through the story of Jeremiah. So sometimes we pluck that verse out and we can try to apply it in a certain way and it just doesn't work out. And that can be really frustrating and hard. But I think we have to remember the context and remember that God does have a plan. Maybe it's a grander plan than just like for like our little individual situation of, what am I going to eat for lunch? And more of like a grand plan of, Jesus is bringing salvation through Christ. Christ calls us to live our lives a certain way so that others can come to know the love and grace of God. And that's really the plan that Jeremiah is talking about in Jeremiah 29:11. So all that to say, I hope you'll continue to join us as we look at different scriptures in the coming weeks. This weekend, we're going to take a look at Philippians 4:13, which I read one commentary writer wrote is probably the most used out of context verse in the entire Bible, which I think is probably true. I hear that one quoted a lot. So I hope you'll join us this weekend, whether in person or online, as we continue on in our sermon series. Looking forward to talking about the context of Philippians 4:13 with you and to see what God has in store for us to learn. So hope you have a great rest of your week, and we'll see y'all next time. Bye.